And our next session is specifically about overcoming the challenges in the road to mass adoption. The experience of both developers and users has absolutely transformed over the course of the last 12 months, become much more accessible, much more user-friendly. And we want to make sure that this continuous evolution is just beginning. Cardano will ensure that this advancement is constantly invested in at every step of the way. And we want to tackle a few myths in this next section too about some of those challenges, some of those hurdles, and some of those speed bumps. And we are delighted to have a really great panel with us. We'll shortly be joined by Lanningham from SundaeSwap, James Dunseith from Gimbalabs, Santiago Carmuega from TxPipe, Andrew Westberg from Newm, and Matthias Benkort, your friend and mine from the awards ceremony, who rocked it last night from Cardano Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it for our panelists.
Okay, so welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. And so we're here to speak a bit about Cardano, building on Cardano, the challenges, the upsides, and what we can do to maybe make the situation a bit better and give advice to newcomers that would like to join this ecosystem, right? So fundamentally, Cardano is a distributed system. There is one main component at core, which is the Cardano node, and a whole myriad of components around that to interact with the node and simplify the whole process. All of you guys are builders of the ecosystem, so maybe let's start with a short round of presentation, starting with you, Pi, what you do, and give us a bit of an idea.
Sure. So I'm Lanningham. I'm the CTO at SundaeSwap, one of the first decentralized exchanges to launch on Cardano. I've been building since about May last year, but been interested in Cardano since 2017.
My name is James. I'm a co-founder at Gimbalabs. We build a distributed API layer for the Cardano blockchain called Dandelion, and we work on educational programming.
Hi, everyone. I'm Santiago. I'm a software developer. I've been one for 20 years. I'm from Buenos Aires, Argentina. A year ago, I founded TxPipe, which is a company that builds open source tools for Cardano developers.
I'm Andrew Westberg. I've been with Cardano since 2017, about the same as Pi. I work for a company called Newm. I'm the CTO there, where we do decentralized music on the blockchain. I also create various tools and utilities for stake pool operators.
Great. So, James, maybe can you start telling us a bit about the challenges and upsides of building with Web3?
Sure. So if you want to teach somebody how to build a website, even if they've never written a line of code, they have a picture of what a website looks like. They can imagine what a nav bar looks like. And if you want to teach somebody what an app does, right? Maybe they've never written a line of code, but they know what a to-do app would do. So at least they have that picture in their head when they start to build. But when people start to build on Cardano, what the heck is a validator? Right? There's no mental model of that yet. What's a UTXO? And so creating these mental models first turns out to be a big challenge, right? And people might be far into their Plutus education by the time it finally clicks. Oh, that's what a validator does.
So is there anything specific maybe to Cardano compared to other blockchains also that makes it either more appealing or maybe more difficult to build on?
I'm sure everybody here has an answer to that.
Maybe Pi?
Yeah. So one of the things that's kind of liberating about building on Web3 is the lack of login credentials. Because everybody has a private key and a public key in their wallet, you can leverage that as your authentication mechanism. So that's one kind of benefit. I didn't want to lead with a negative. Specific to Cardano, kind of one of the challenges so far has been that we're on the bleeding edge. Often, while building SundaeSwap, it felt very much like we were in the 80s because we were having to hand optimize bytecode and worry about 16 kilobyte limits. And so it felt very much like we were on kind of early machines, and we were in a Wild West era of software. And that was very new to me and new to, I think, a lot of developers on Cardano. There was also a kind of big lack of tooling, especially in the early days. It's gotten a lot better in the last 6 months or so, but being unable to inspect your transactions or know why they failed, no log messages, no debugger, things like that, definitely created very unique challenges for building, especially in those early days.
Yeah, so Cardano took pretty from the start this design choice of separating on-chain and off-chain stuff, right? And maybe Andrew, can you tell us a bit about that, because we speak a lot about the on-chain stuff, and it seems like an overwhelming part. But how is that actually divided in your own project?
Yeah, so at Newm, most of our code is off-chain. So we have 15 to 20 developers, and we have one developer that works on the on-chain piece. So most of it is all about the user interface, the user interaction, and then all the tooling that goes all the way down to the point where you get stuff on the chain. And like you guys said, there's a lot of tooling missing, and we do have to build some of those pieces. But what we are doing is kind of plowing that road for those that come after us. So it's a lot of our companies are doing a lot of stuff open source. I know Santiago does open source, so it's a very good way to help not just your own project, but it helps all the projects out there. But yeah,
Santiago?
Yes, can I add something about on-chain?
Yeah.
Which I think it's interesting. There's a saying that goes, hardware is hard. That's because doing hardware, it's very complex. Not that software can be complex, but it has different challenges, hardware. And it's curious because building smart contracts, it's sort of like building hardware. Because once you ship it, you can hotfix it, you can patch it, that's it, it's immutable. So I think that one of the challenges is how we approach smart contract development with a different mindset than the one that we use when developing software.
Yeah. Bye.
Yeah, and the fact that most of, like Andrew at SundaeSwap, most of the code we write is off-chain code. And this really surprised me, but it's kind of fundamental to Cardano. The way I describe it is kind of classical smart contract blockchains like Ethereum have legs, and Cardano has locks. So when you execute a smart contract on Ethereum, you're telling it to go and do something. Go and update this counter, go and update this user's balance. But on Cardano, you're locking and you're kind of deciding what the permissions are. You're saying, are you allowed to do this? And that means that the bulk of the logic for kind of tracking state, updating state, is implemented in whatever language you're building the transaction in. So there's this myth, maybe, that Cardano is hard to build on because it uses Haskell, this obscure programming language. But really kind of just that small permissioned core is built in Plutus, which looks very similar to Haskell. But most of your code can be written in whatever language that you want to write it in.
So how does that play with, quality, robustness, security? Like, it sounds like there is a lot of trade-off with that, and also like updatability of your programs. Right? If you release a smart contract, you made a mistake, what happens there? Like, maybe James, can you explore a bit?
I really like Santiago's metaphor that it's like building hardware. Right? It's hard to replace, and even having a plan for when and how are we going to update the smart contract part of the dApp. And there's also this balance between simplifying in the short term, right, to bring users in right now, and exposing people, whether they're developers or end users, to what Pai is talking about, right? We have these options. And it's a hard balance, right? So I don't know how we can best balance immediate need to onboard users and to onboard developers with this imperative to really distribute the knowledge about how these tools work.
Yeah, and kind of to the point of how does it impact security and is that a trade-off? In my mind, it's really just kind of a enshrinement of good software practices. You know, if you're writing a classic Web 2 app, generally what you try to do is you try to kind of minimize the surface area of code that you have to trust. You have like some very small core module that it kind of handles the permissions and authentication of your app, and then everything streams through that. And so to me, Cardano's kind of methodology is kind of baking that in from the start, right? So if you build your smart contracts, which are all about the permissions of how you spend and use funds and how you update that state, that requires an intense amount of care, kind of with that hardware model. But the security of the rest of the system, to a large extent, flows from that. Now, that doesn't mean you can get careless in your off-chain code, but it does kind of bring a very strong sense of comfort and security, knowing that that kind of small permission core is at least protecting the funds.
Yeah, so again, this hardware analogy, or making sure that what you ship on-chain is very secure, and then you have a bit more freedom on what happened off-chain. And on that topic, actually, so Andrew, you said most of your team is actually doing off-chain code. So how does, we speak a lot about Haskell and the role of Haskell in Cardano, and how does that actually play in your, in your company? Do you have any Haskell developers there? And
it's an entire myth that you have to be a Haskell developer to work on Cardano. Most of the Cardano developers I know spend more of their time in other languages. There's a lot of Rust, there's a lot of Kotlin, there's a lot of JavaScript. Everybody's doing their own language, and you can actually bring your own language that you're used to and is comfortable for you to Cardano. Everything, it starts with the scientific papers. So if you want to dive in and kind of figure out at the lowest level how things work, you can then start to build a tool set on the language you like, even PHP. So yeah, at our company, most of our developers came from me just onboarding them from my past career. I worked at Nike and Walmart as an Android developer, so we had a lot of Kotlin experience, and so that's kind of what our shop looks like, is mostly Kotlin, and then some other languages on top of that. But the Haskell piece, you do have to kind of trust the person you pick to work on that, and then also trust the process of auditing that code later.
So yeah, Pai?
Yeah, and just to add on to that, the types of Haskell code that you're writing for smart contracts ultimately are really, really simple. There's a bit of boilerplate that can be really confusing and intimidating at first, of how you plug your smart contract into kind of the machinery that the Cardano team has built. But at the end of the day, the contract itself is a bunch of ands and ors. I'm going to be giving a workshop later today at, I think, 2 p.m. on building some smart contracts, and we're going to build a smart contract live, and I hope to show kind of just how easy it is. So even if you're not a Haskell developer, I came to this not a Haskell developer, you can pick it up very quickly.
So out of curiosity, maybe all of you, what is your language of choice? What do you use on a daily basis to build on Cardano?
So my language of choice kind of across my career has been either C# or Rust. At SundaeSwap, just because a lot of my engineers were a lot more familiar with it, we build in Golang.
Okay.
I'm a simpleton. I'm most comfortable with JavaScript. But the real answer to that question is it's really that human layer. And I want to go back to what Andrew said about trusting your Plutus developer, right? I mean, yes, there's the programming language. There's also the financial and the governance language, and those big decisions you're making when you build those in. The code, at the end of the day, is simple, right? The hard part is making those decisions about what that code is going to say, and there's a lot of values encoded in that work.
Yeah. My language of choice is Rust. Everything that we do in TxPipe is mostly Rust. But I want to go back to a point that we were discussing yesterday, that source code is a liability, as you were saying. It's not about the source code that you have, it's rather about the process and the team and how you produce that source code. I think that, yes, languages have their trade-offs. Some are good for different things, but one should focus on the procedures and the people performing the job of developing the software.
Yeah, my personal language is Kotlin. I also do a lot of work in Rust. At our company, we also have some iOS developers, so they like Swift. It doesn't really matter. There's places in Cardano for everybody.
Okay, so Santiago, maybe how do we get started with that? Like, how would you recommend someone? Like, what kind of infrastructure do we need? What's you know?
Yeah,
how do we get
that's something I've been trying to get my head around for quite some time. There is a steep learning curve when you get into Cardano. It happens with many new technologies. And there are different pain points. I think that one of those is the infrastructure part. You have to set up a node, you have to configure DBSync, you have to install all the Plutus libraries, you have to compile them. It takes a while. It might take hours, even days. And also the fact that they are not multi-tenant. If you want to set up your own development environment, you need your own node, you need your own stuff. And you can share that with developers. So one way is to go the hard way, and I think that it's valuable to go that path because you learn a lot. But also we have to think about developers that are getting to know Cardano and that they just need something quick to understand the essence and the value that it provides. We've been working in TxPipe with this platform called Educator. The idea is that you can spin up cloud environments quickly. Thank you. Yes, the idea is that developers, without any specific knowledge of how to stop everything, they can spin up quickly, sort of like a virtual machine, a workspace, where you have everything installed already. And you can have the node, access to DBSync, a VS Code IDE, where you have the Plutus libraries already there, and the Haskell toolchain. So I would say that if you want to get a quick glance and get your hands dirty, coding some stuff, look for the pink button in the GitHub repositories, and that will give you Cardano workspace.
Yeah, and I think, James, you're also, as part of Gimbalabs, doing some kind of things like that, like serving some API layer and giving accessibility to people. So,
my partner, Roberto, is the mastermind behind the Dandelion API layer, which makes it much easier for people to spin up all these tools that Santiago is naming. And what we try to do is give people a picture of what that full stack application looks like.
Yeah.
It's one thing to write a smart contract. It's another to get to the point where you have a button on a front end that triggers a transaction. And when a developer first has that experience, right, they press the button and their wallet pops up and they say, I did it. I made it all the way, right? And it doesn't have to do much, but you have to have that first experience, and then you start making it more complicated as you go.
Yeah. So maybe, Pi, I have a question for you, and I've already asked you that question, but I really like the answer. So if you have to give one advice for someone on how to get started with Cardano, how to build knowledge and an expertise on the deep stuff of Cardano, what would you say?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is just kind of hop on the preview environment and get your hands dirty. Start like building transactions yourself. One piece of advice I've been giving to people recently, I found that one of the highest value exercises you can go through is to implement a transaction parser. On the IOG GitHub repos, they have a full CDDL spec, which tells you kind of byte for byte how the transaction is laid out, and going through the exercise of writing just a small program to parse each of those fields or maybe serialize your own transactions will give you kind of an understanding of exactly how a transaction is laid out and what each field that goes into a transaction is. And so I've found, and my engineers have found, that that clears up a lot of the kind of mystery around Cardano, because suddenly you see, oh, when somebody's delegating to a stake pool, it's a certificate in the transaction, and this is what the certificate looks like. And it kind of just causes a lot of those hand-wavy things that we just say, oh, well, just, the Cardano node handles that. It causes those to kind of snap into focus, and it becomes really clear. So that's, doesn't have to be production-worthy code, but it's a very high-value exercise that you can go through.
And it's one of the beautiful things with Cardano, right? Everything is about transactions in the end. So once you master a transaction, you've mastered 80% of Cardano already, right? Even what's going on chain now, and all the governance and all of that is also going to be on building transactions ultimately. So on that topic, like, if you had to recommend tools that you guys use on a daily basis to build transactions, to write your applications, like maybe what would you all recommend, starting with Andrew?
Yeah, so the tool I have used the most to build transaction is called Firehose. It's closed source. It's the engine behind drip drops. So it is always building transactions and firing off. I mean, it's probably generating 10% of the total chain volume right now. But yeah, that was exactly what I did, is what Pi said. I went in and I built my own transaction builder. So I had to learn exactly what fields, were the input UTXOs, what's the outputs. And you get a very deep understanding of exactly how to build a transaction, exactly how to sign a transaction. That's not a mystery either. It's just another field. You just stick a little hash on there after you've figured out what the hash of the transaction body is. So it's kind of like peeling an onion as you're learning Cardano and learning what a transaction is. You just kind of peel a layer off, and it becomes easier and easier as you go.
Yeah, for building transactions, I think that the obvious choices are also the Cardano multi-platform lib and the Cardano serialization library. But newer, more high-level libraries are appearing that make use of those and other services, such as Lucid, which is great, and the Mesh API. So yeah, I think those are my options regarding transaction building.
Andrew?
I forgot to mention, Ogmios is a really great intro to learning how Cardano works. It's an open source tool. It's written in Haskell, but you can interface with it with a WebSocket, which is kind of cool. And so I've built another library on top of that called Cogmios. So that's kind of how the Cardano ecosystem works. Somebody builds something, and you just kind of build up layers on top of it. So Cogmios is Kotlin talking to Ogmios. And that's what we're going to use on Newm to submit all our transactions through that kind of pipeline.
We shouldn't forget Cardano CLI, written in Rust, of course. And one of the things I love about building a transaction on CLI is it helps you make a plan for the dApp that you need to build. So you can say, OK, line by line. And once a transaction is built, now you can reference that as you move on to your off-chain code. And it almost serves as a checklist, right? OK, did I get those inputs? OK, where's that one coming from? Where am I pulling the contract code from? What's the output? What's the signature?
I'm going to widen the question a bit beyond just building transactions, because I feel like they've covered everything. But some other really great tools, if you're getting started on Cardano, Andrew mentioned Ogmios, which, if anybody didn't know, is written by this gentleman right here. Another really great tool that you've written is Kupo, which is a chain indexer. So it can kind of very, very quickly blast through the history of the chain and build up an index of, at any point in time, what UTXOs were in this wallet or what assets were in this wallet. So that's also been very useful. At SundaeSwap, we maintain OgmiGo, which is the Golang wrapper for Ogmios. I do a lot of work with the Cardano CLI, and we've built up kind of a battery of these small utility scripts that make interacting with the CLI kind of even simpler. Maybe we'll open source those at some point.
Please do.
and then just for understanding what you're doing and understanding the chain, I've been really enjoying C Explorer lately as my kind of blockchain explorer of choice. And there's a CBOR inspector if you kind of are dealing with those raw CBOR payloads called cbor.nemo that is just fantastic. So.
Good. So a kind of similar topic, but also a great source of frustration usually, it's documentation, right? How you get access to information. One thing that the developer survey that we did back in July shown was that there is not a lack of documentation. There is actually an abundance of documentation. It's sometimes a bit scattered across places, and it's on a very different levels. You have scientific papers, you have very low-level specification ledger rules, you have some tutorials, some installation instructions. So how does one navigate around that? And how do you feel about documentation? How do you treat that? And what's tips you could give to people that want to get started and just are overwhelmed with this amount of information?
I think.
Okay, yeah. So the two main considerations with documentation, the two things that make it difficult are discoverability and freshness, right? And so I think, like you were saying, there's an abundance of documentation, but the big challenge up until maybe recently, and maybe you can talk about that, is how do I find it, right? The technical specifications are in one place, and the stack exchange is in another place, and there used to be a set of guides for spinning up stake pools, and that was in a different place, and some of it was out of date because we've gone through kind of a couple of hard forks, and so keeping track of that all and keeping it up to date, I imagine was very difficult for the Cardano team. The kind of solution for documentation that SundaeSwap did is just looking at the code, because at the end of the day, that's the canonical source of truth, but I would not recommend that as a path because it's a very painful path. But from what I understand, there's a new portal for documentation that it's the Cardano Foundation has been working on, or it's community-driven, right?
Yeah, maybe Santiago can tell us a bit about that. Right.
Yeah, so I feel the frustration myself. I would like to have one place with everything fresh and updated, but I think the other day we were talking about this, and we should understand that Cardano is a diversified ecosystem. We have many people, many projects, and so it's going to be a mess, but it's a nice mess. We need to try to understand that that is the way to go. Like in biology, biodiversity makes the ecosystem stronger. So I think that we should encourage as much documentation as we can, and the developer portal, which I must be honest, I didn't know about it until recently, but it does that. It's like a big index of everything that we have, messy as it is, but a great resource if you want to navigate throughout all of the projects and the documentation that each project provides.
Yeah, if we mean what we say about this ecosystem, the documentation better be a mess for a long time, right? This is, we want people to come in and try to find new ways to explain this stuff. What I would add to the discoverability part is people discovering the question they're asking in the first place, right? So Stack Exchange is a great tool if I know what I'm asking for. And so the more experiences we can give people to learn the first thing, to then discover a hurdle for themselves and then have a good question to ask, right? So when we talk about off-chain code, one of the hardest things, and Andrew, you referenced it, right? But in the long run, how am I going to build transactions efficiently, both from the perspective of in time and in cost? And that's a really hard thing to explain to someone when they're just getting started. But everybody eventually gets there. Wait, that transaction cost is how high, right? I have to wait for the last transaction to be done before I can build the next thing. And those are the questions that each of us discovered in the code itself, right? When there was a lack of documentation, when there was a lack of design patterns, maybe. And by diving into these things, we recognize now these are challenges. And I'm not sure if you can replace that completely just by telling somebody, hey, here's how it is, now you can just run with it.
Yeah, I just want to mention, we've talked about this developer portal. I'm going to give you the website, developers.cardano.org. So that's a great place to start if you're a developer, or even just somebody that may be interested in becoming a developer. Now, once you dive down into that site, you also may, shameless plug, come across my YouTube channel called Nerd Out. And I dive into some of these deeper topics, and I try to bring it, down pretty deep, but I do try to dig myself out of the hole most of the time. So it's hopefully a good introduction to, thank you. Hopefully a good introduction to some of those more deeper developer topics on Cardano. And the website is filled with all kinds of good content. And then as you dig down, you're eventually going to hit the specs or the documentation. So a lot of the code I write, it was because I went and read the scientific papers. Here's the implementation of the networking protocol. I'm sure, Matthias, you had to look through that to figure out how to write Ogmios. I did a similar process on Firehose. So don't be afraid of something just because some really famous scientist names are attached to it. You can figure it out.
So, to summarize maybe like what you just said, right? It's really this process of discovering the need for documentation as you write things, right? You start something, and at some point you hit the wall, and you think, I need more detail on that, so I'm gonna look a bit deeper, and eventually you end up on the scientific papers or the engineering specification, and this is where you start really diving in. And sometimes you don't have the answer, so that's where you look at the source code itself, right? And like, would you recommend maybe people to also write some documentation and how this process works, right? If you have something that's not fully explained, like, can you just go forward and try to explain it yourself, maybe? Oh.
I think that's a great idea. I'll go for it.
Yeah, no, I think one thing that I've learned with my math background and now with kind of Cardano and with computer science is you never really actually know that you understand something until you've taught it to someone else. And so writing documentation is very hard. That's why there's so little of it across the entire engineering profession. But it is could be a very useful exercise, even if it's just internal to your team, or even if it's just for yourself, and you write it and then you read it back and you're like, this is garbage. It helps you flesh out those ideas. So yeah, I think everybody should go through the process of writing some kind of documentation, and if it turns out good, share it online.
Yeah, it's a great way to get started in open source projects. Sometimes you just want to contribute and you find some missing part in the documentation. That's a great way to contribute and get to know the project and maybe contribute some other stuff later.
So a bit on that area, right? How does the CIP process and CIPs in general can play a role with that and with maybe the discovery of the ecosystem as well? There are many CIPs regions on many different subjects, and the new process we're trying to introduce also adds the CPS component where people can sort of describe their problems in a way, try to formulate the problem they have and the thing they are missing from the ecosystem. So what do you think that role can play in a developer journey in the ecosystem? Andrew?
Yeah, so if anyone doesn't know, they've started a new process called instead of the Cardano improvement proposal, it's the Cardano problem statement. And this is where maybe there's a problem on Cardano, but maybe you don't know exactly the right approach to fix it. So as a new dev, you can create these Cardano problem statements, get feedback from other people, and kind of flesh it out before it moves into the SIP. I created one of these. I didn't really need it, but it seemed like a useful thing. So I wanted to kill the idea of a pointer address on chain. A pointer address, if you're not familiar with it, it's instead of a payment key and a stake key, they take away the stake key, and instead that's a pointer to a place on the blockchain where the actual stake key was registered. You can read the Cardano problem statement, it's out there, but I said, well, that's a concept we don't need to take forward into the future. What are the best ways to solve it? And it got a bunch of good discussion about how we can solve that problem. And so now that'll move forward. I'll take those recommendations and build the SIP process. But the SIP process is good for learning as well. So,
Yes.
And also to get the insider knowledge of like what's coming next to Cardano. It's kind of a good place to get that.
Couldn't agree more with that. Yeah, I've learned a lot by reading SIP discussions. And not only are you learning the details of the code as it's being developed, but you're learning these problem statements. And you're learning the governance part, which is so important to Cardano, right? This is our shared resource, and to understand the different perspectives people have on problems is so important.
Yeah, we were touching a bit on that yesterday on the open source panel, right? Mm-hmm. But there is a very, very thin relationship between like governance and open source in the end, because open source projects are all about governance. Mm-hmm. You need to see how to welcome people on board. And so how do you actually approach, right, governance on open source project, on code collaboration? So
you go straight to Twitter and you just start a fight.
Please no.
That's it, yeah.
Okay. Okay, thanks. Maybe Santiago, do you have any other advice on that, or like?
On governance, yeah, I think that it's very different in an open source small project like the ones that I'm involved, and maybe Cardano itself, where the stakes are so high. Yeah, I wouldn't say about. I don't have any advice on how to approach governance in Cardano as a whole, but I think that open source. The approach that I find useful in TxPipe, for example, is the one that it's called do-ocracy, where the people that make the work make the decisions about the roadmap and what gets merged or not. And that, I think it works very well, because if you're involved in the project, you know what it requires, so you get a saying on what gets on main branch.
Yeah, I think open source in the Cardano ecosystem is very important. If you're at all able to open source your project, it's very important for helping the other teams, because we'll all win if we have a lot of successful projects on Cardano. So at Newm, we open source all of our code, including all the smart contracts, including all the front-end code, including all the app code. Everything is open source. And we've already seen, because of that, we've seen collaborations with other companies. They're not competing in the same space as us, but maybe they need to do the same type of thing. So maybe they need to have a smart contract that can generate NFTs with a policy that's open forever, but the smart contract is what guarantees uniqueness. And so we've had conversations with the Lanningham guys, with several others that want to utilize those same smart contracts, but just for a totally different purpose. And that's what's really cool to see about open source in this community and how it's grown.
Yeah, and I do way less open source than I would like to. Unfortunately, it takes a lot of effort to kind of maintain a very high quality open source repository, and my time is very limited these days. But pointing kind of outside of the Cardano ecosystem, one project that I think we can look to for a lot of inspiration on how to really run a fantastic open source community is the Rust compiler. So the Rust team has a lot of really great practices, and they're a very welcoming community to new open source contributors. They're very efficient about, I've had 2 very, very small pull requests merged to that, and it was a great experience. And I think one thing they get really right is that trade-off between the kind of larger your population pool, the less nuance there is, and the less kind of decision-making power you have, because it's very easy for decisions to get bogged down in differences of aesthetic, where people kind of really stick to their guns of, the classic in engineering is semicolons or not, or tabs versus new lines. So you see those kinds of aesthetic decisions stopping up kind of large decision-making bodies. And so the way the Rust compiler team tackles that is kind of breaking it up into smaller committees that are in charge of certain areas, but then doing that work in the open so that anybody can have input onto that, but you don't kind of get mired down with these decision logjams. So I thought that would be a great example that we could learn from.
Yeah, definitely.
Kind of coming back to what Andrew was saying about how these open source projects start on Cardano, it can lead you to the two forms of governance we have in this ecosystem. One of the benefits of decentralized systems is you can fork the code and start to make your own decisions. We don't like semicolons? Okay, right? But it can be a lot more substantial than that. And once you start to do that, you fork when it's possible. You change the code to fit your community's needs. And then you run into those points where that's not possible, right? Oh, that's a protocol level decision. Okay, now I'm into the SIP process here.
Okay. So we have about like 5 minutes left. So maybe one last question to all of you. If you today were starting anew with your Cardano journey, is there something you would do differently than what you did? Right? Some kind of mistakes you did or path you took that took you way too long and in the end didn't lead to anything?
I think that C-word parsing was something I would like to skip, but you can't. Yeah. No, I think that I would do the same thing that I did, which is scratch your own itch, as we were discussing yesterday. The idea that you see something missing, some problem, and just try to approach it and see if you can fix it. And going the open source way, it's a great way to get involved with people. It's a great way to get feedback. It's a lot more messy and it requires a lot of extra effort, I think, but it's a learning experience also. So I would recommend going the open source way as a path of getting into Cardano.
I would sleep a lot more. I think Andrew was the one mentioning this earlier. It took me a long time to stop being afraid of the technical specifications. And so I kind of just assumed that it'd be a waste of time because it would be so abstracted or so kind of far from the implementation that I was kind of trying to figure things out from doing, and encountered a lot of frustrations there that are just very clearly answered in like a paragraph or two in the specification. And you just have to understand that the language they're going to use isn't going to be code. It's going to be more mathy. But once you can kind of get past that, it's a very, very valuable resource.
Yeah, I echo what Pi said. I would try to be more fearless and just to jump into doing something. And if I can make our plug for Gimbalabs project-based learning, this is where people can come and just get started doing something. And then once they're already working on a project, having that community to start talking to about things to really build up that confidence.
Yeah, I think for me, what I would change is I would try to be a little more collaborative. My learning journey, I'm always, well, all of us engineers, we tend to be not the most outgoing people. But, so I would dive down until I finally hit a roadblock, and then only then would I reach out to somebody to ask questions and stuff like that. When I was trying to figure out how to talk to the node, I created a little Telegram channel. It was called Talk to the Node, and it was like Arnold Schwarzenegger with the talk to the hand. And that was a really cool community, and we got some IOG people in there, and we actually, for the first time, talked to the node with a language other than Haskell. And it was really cool to finally make that happen, and once it clicked, and So yeah, I think I would push all of that collaborative stuff I had to learn the hard way and push that earlier to say just reach out to people who are knowledgeable. You know, everybody on this panel is knowledgeable. They want to help Cardano as a whole. So reach out.
So yeah, I think I can speak for the whole panel saying that we'll be very happy to take any of this conversation outside of the panel line during the summit and continue them with people that would like to engage on any of those topics. As you said, like there are many people knowledgeable in the ecosystem, and I think they are also willing to explain, willing to share stuff. So do not hesitate to reach out to people. And well, since we're here, right, it's a good moment to chat. And I think that's it for right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.